This class is a very big transition class because we made a transition between part one to part two. Oh, there it is. Part two, unmasking the structures of power. Now, probably if you have an electronic version, you might not have noticed this transition because you just skipped over that page. But in the paper book, we are now in part two of the course, which is unmasking the structures of power. Forget what part one was called. Back. Part one, anthropology for the 21st century. That's strange. Part one should have been called anthropology for the last century, probably. In part one, we talked about what we might consider the basic ideas of anthropology. What is anthropology? The idea of culture, the practice of fieldwork, and language. And as we noted during these things, these concepts appear pretty early in anthropology. We talked about the idea of cultural relativism and linguistic relativism. So we traced linguistic relativism, for example, back to Franz Boas, Edward Sapir back in 1912 or something. So these are pretty deep 100-year ago things. And they're pretty basic to the practice of anthropology. But in this section, I was going to say, one of the things we're going to ask is, how did the deployment of these ideas work in terms of what anthropology was trying to not just analyze, but do in the world? So now this is actually the question that is the quiz question, which is, what is the biggest idea that cultural anthropology ever had? The biggest, most important idea we ever had. Biggest idea anthropology ever had. Most important thing we ever said.
Can we answer?
Yeah.
Cultural relativism.
Cultural relativism. Let me rephrase this a little bit. I would say the biggest idea of US cultural anthropology. Maybe around the world, I would agree with you. Maybe it's cultural relativism is a bigger idea than what happened in the US. There's a particular thing that we have in the United States that is important for cultural anthropology to say. Help?
Is it racist?
Yeah, and what I'm asking is, what would anthropology say about culture in relation to our ideas about race? The first biggest idea of anthropology was that culture, your learned behavior, was a much more important thing than your biological race. So 100 years ago, for example, people were talking about culture and race. They weren't necessarily saying that race wasn't real, because they didn't know the genetics and stuff yet as much as we do now. But they were saying, people like Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, right? That the learned behavior, what we learn how to do, is much more important than whatever biological stuff we think is going on. And so the idea was that we're going to educate people to become conscious of culture. If you remember, we talked about how back in the 1920s, the idea of culture really wasn't around in the popular sphere. And if it was, it meant going to theater and museums and material culture kinds of things, artistic stuff. And anthropology introduces the idea that culture is our whole life. It's everything we do and learn as people in a society. And if we can help people to understand that, then they will become more culturally relative. They will become less obnoxious about their society and about their own values. Again, this is particularly true in the United States, where we have strange ideas. But yes, you're right that later on, starting say in the 1960s, is when we get more of a challenge to the idea that race is even a biological thing. So again, before this, we're just saying that learned behavior is more important than race. But later on, people using genetics and other means would question the whole idea of race as a valid or something that was meaningful in our lives. And so the point of the matter, or the new idea, is we're going to educate people that race is a social construct or a cultural construct, that in fact, our culture, our learned behavior is what teaches us to see race. So not only have we said that culture is more important than biological race, we're now able to say that is in fact our culture that lets us see race, and we're going to help people know that. One gets worried sometimes if you hear the same thing over and over. Is it because it's true or just because we keep repeating it? So let's deal with this, because in some ways, this idea that race is a social construct or race is a cultural construct, we hear it so often that we get, let's just deal with the why we say that, or the science of why we think race, bless you, is not genetically or biologically valid. When we compare ourselves genetically to each other, small differences. Genetically speaking, there's not a lot of difference. We're not going to dwell too much on this in this class, because this is not a biological anthropology class, but I just want to go over some of the basics, which is that since Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens, we've been mixing around with each other, mating with each other, moving around. We've always been in one continuous gene pool. So it is estimated that we are 99.9% genetically alike. And the differences that we see, which are very visible, it's not that there's no difference among human beings, but the differences we see arose relatively recently in human evolution. They seem to have arisen as adaptations to specific local environments in the last 50,000 years or so, which in evolutionary terms is nothing. It's not very much time at all. And so most of the human variation that we see occurs gradually across a continuum or across a geographical range. The biologists call this clinal variation, or clines of variation. That means that things are moving gradually across a range. I'll show you a couple pictures of that. But before we get too into that, what would happen if we took various human traits and tried to sort people out according to hairiness, skin color, lactose tolerance, malaria resistance, all those things? What would happen to our groups? Lactose intolerance, yeah. That's one of the.
The further east you go, the more lactose intolerant people are.
I should have put a graph up of lactose intolerance and tolerance. It is true that in East Asia, that is the least lactose tolerant populations. However, there are populations in Europe of very light-skinned people who are lactose tolerant, and populations in Africa and in the Middle East of people who are very dark-skinned or in between, who are also lactose tolerant. Before we get too far into this lactose tolerance stuff, I just want to say that as we know from Mendelian genetics and how our traits come together and don't come as a complete package, but come as these individual traits and gets combined and recombined in different ways, there's no absolute correspondence between, say, a particular skin color and lactose tolerance. So you can be what counts the most in terms of lactose tolerance is whether your ancestors were from an area where they raised dairy cattle. By the way, if you are lactose intolerant, you are in the majority of the world's population. 2/3 of the world is lactose intolerant, and it's only in these weird places in parts of Northern Europe and West Africa and Saudi Arabia that they developed, and this is in the last 6,000 or 7,000 years, lactose tolerance as adults. So that, again, that doesn't correspond to skin color. Something like malarial resistance or sickle cell trait, which we often in the United States have mapped onto race, actually does not map onto race. It arises anywhere that malaria is present. So populations in Greece and again in Saudi Arabia also exhibit sickle cell trait. So there's no package of traits that come together. And our big race categories that we sort the world into, at least in the United States, of black and white, they are representative of something, but they don't describe the real variation that humans have. And I want to be clear that we are varied biologically speaking. We have all these different traits. We have height and build and all these things, but these traits usually vary clinally. So this is a graph or a global map of skin color variation by mapped onto what we would consider indigenous populations to these areas before 1500. People started moving transoceanically. And as you can see here, this skin color varies clinally, or is an example of clinal variation. There's no line at which, if you're to walk between these places, there's no line that you cross or river or mountain range that you cross and you're all of a sudden the race has changed. There's going to be gradual variation all the way up and down this range. Why are these skin colors different? How's the environment that we're in? So mostly this seems to be, it arose because of natural selection. Those people who had moved up to the more northern and more southern extremes lost their ability to produce melanin. And that turns out to be a somewhat of a natural selection advantages if you need to absorb vitamin D. Also, of course, if you're in a tropical sunlit climate, there's a advantage to being having greater sun reflectance or darker skin in those areas. So this seems to be what originally happened. By the way, if you find yourself in an area where you're not getting enough vitamin D from the sun, what should you do? You have to take a pill.
Yes.
Most Americans should be taking vitamin D supplements. We have a large vitamin D deficiency problem. The biological anthropologist Frank Livingstone in 1962 make a very famous statement. You may have been exposed to this statement if you've taken biological anthropology. There are no races, there are only clines. So what he meant by that is that people vary gradually, and the idea that you could group them into these large categories where you walk across a line and all of a sudden you're in the black as opposed to the white is just not a good way of understanding the world. And I want to point out here, Livingstone wasn't saying that everybody was the same. He was saying that there are clinal variation. There is this gradual variation. And if you lined all the people up from the darkest skin to the lightest skin, you would see that there's quite a range of variation there, but they all are on a continuum. Where did we get this race idea from? We have these clinal variations. This is a different skin color variation map where you go in and put something on people's inner arms, because that's usually the least exposed to the sun, and measure it according to from 1 to 30 or so. But you have this clinal variation, but it's not until people start moving people around transoceanically and getting people together, sometimes quite forcibly from different regions, that you have people start to put people into these boxes. At least in the United States, the first use of the word white and whiteness was in 1691, which is at once a long time ago, but it's also in human history a very short amount of time. So our whole idea that people are divided into races is actually a pretty recent idea. Now, that's not to say that people in the old days didn't look at each other and describe physical difference. They just didn't necessarily put people into these categories that we use today. So now, Guess gives us, I don't know if you were able to look at all these pictures. Guess gives us these pictures of different people thought it might be fun to look at them. He gives us this person, and this person. What do you think? How many races are there? Well, let me put it to you this. In the United States, are those one race, two races, or three races? Those people. Two question mark? Traditionally in the United States, the line of race is pretty much here. There's only two races there, black and white. Whereas in other countries, they might divide this up into three races. Here's another question for you. In the United States, is this person of a different race than the ones above or the same? A loaded question. Why is it a loaded question? We're just talking about what people believe in the United States. I'm not asking you for your belief. I'm asking you what people believe. Really?
Why?
Oh, wait, you're putting this person with this person?
Maybe?
Maybe?
No?
No? What if I said, I don't know where this person is from. I'm going to make something up. What if I said this person was from Mexico? Now, what race? Is that a race? In the United States, officially on the census, you're supposed to choose between Hispanic and not Hispanic. And then you're supposed to choose race. And everybody's supposed to do that. Now, again, I'm not saying this is right because we know this is all baloney, but on the census this is how it's done. And so on the census, this person could, now a lot of people believe Mexican is a race, including some Mexicans, which is to say they will write down something that's called mestizo or mixed, which is in some ways what they think of as the official Mexican identity of being mixed. Mestizos. And so this person, I don't know, they might consider themselves, by the way, about half of the people on the US Census who check off Hispanic also check off white, a much smaller percentage check off black, and a decent percentage also check off some other race. By that, some people believe they are thinking about mestizo and race mixture, which is in some ways the national origin story of Mexico, maybe not true to varying degrees, but it's the idea that we are all one mixed race or mestizo race. New race? Being mean. Are these two people in the same race? My point in showing you all this and making you uncomfortable is that in fact, our notions of race in the United States come from a very small sample of the world. And so we get very confused when people from India show up and we're like, because they weren't really part of this colonial encounter, at least at the beginning. And so people from India vary in skin tone from quite light to quite dark, but like in our scheme, we're just like, we don't know what to do. People from Saudi Arabia, we don't know what to do. People from Latin America, where there's perhaps greater emphasis on race mixture as, like I said, mestizaje or mixture, we don't know what to do. And so for those of you who have tuned in to, say, Trump's comments about Harris and of Asian and African American as in Jamaican ancestry, it seems to explode his head. We can't deal with mixture. But this is in part because our sample is weird. The census is interesting because up until the year 2000, you were only allowed to check off one box. That was it. No combinations, just one box. And it was actually often the census taker, the person who came to your door, who decided. So they'd decide what race you were, and they'd check off one box. Now in the year 2000, this changed, and you could check off more than one box. You can also, and you're able to do this yourself, and you can also write in anything you want. I don't know if times have changed for the better, but it's definitely a different system. Now, what does this system do? Why would this system be useful for colonial rule, putting people into different racial categories? What does it justify? Yeah. So race justifies the idea of race, and trying to put people into these boxes would justify the inequalities that were being produced, particularly the transatlantic slave trade. And so if you try to say that certain people are inferior or superior based on their race and lock them into certain labor categories, then that justifies or makes the inequalities that were being enforced seem more natural. The United States actually, in terms of the overall number of enslaved persons, was not very many in comparison to where people went. It's not nothing. It's obviously a decent amount, but it's about 500,000. There are several islands in the Caribbean which received over 1 million enslaved Africans. So there are several pretty small islands in the Caribbean that got more people from Africa than the entire what would become the United States. And the real importer is Brazil, which got about 4 million people from Africa, or about 40% of the overall enslavement trade. And most of these people were taken from their homelands in order to cultivate sugarcane. That was the biggest mover of people into this system. So it's no surprise that in Brazil, there may be a different way of thinking about race. Now, in Brazil, anthropologists have usually say that what people do is really scrutinize people's skin color. And so they have, depending on where you are, maybe as many as 100, 200 different terms that you have for race or skin color. So it's a very different way of doing race. There's not the big overarching categories that we use. Now, Guess says here that some people, based on this, have gone to Brazil and they say, oh, we're in a racial democracy because there aren't these divides between 1, 2, or 3 different races, and people seem to be getting along. Now, what this seems to be, though, once we examine this, is that there's this mythology in Brazil that that's what they are. They're in a racial democracy, which has been promoted also by outside scholars, probably coming usually from places like the United States, and being surprised at how much fluidity there is as compared to the rather rigid hierarchies that we usually have. What's the reality? Yeah, so there's a tremendous amount of inequality in Brazil. It's one of the most unequal countries in the world, and the social hierarchy is usually based on class, and it seems to mostly align to skin color, what we call colorism, in which the lighter skin tones are preferred and tend to be at the top. And so it's more like a gradual thing, but it's not necessarily a better thing. So in Brazil, they also believe that your skin color can change, or I mean, your race can change over the course of your lifetime. And so you can be born one thing and be different. And they also have a phrase that says money whitens. And so, the more money you have, the more you get to the top, the more you get to be part of the upper class. But yes, the soccer player, or as the people around the world refer to it, football player, who this refers to is Pele, who was once considered the greatest soccer player of all time. I'm not sure if Messi has displaced him, but yeah, he would be what in the United States we would consider to be very dark skinned, but some people in Brazil would say, oh no, he's white because money whitens. So it's a very different way of doing race. Now, let's go back to the United States and how we do race. There's Halle Berry, best actresses of all time, won an Oscar for Best Actress in 2002. Why was it a big deal for Halle Berry to win an Oscar in 2002 for Best Actress?
The first Black actress to win one or something?
She is the first Black or African American actress to win Best Actress. So that was a big deal. People got very excited about this. How many have there been since then, since 2002? 0. There have been none. So she looks back on this moment and she's like, I thought it was going to mean something, but it didn't mean anything because here we still are with one, Halle Berry. How do we know that Halle Berry is Black? Her skin color. That's what we think. Her features. She talks about it. You may know who that is. Her mom. Her biological mom, not her adopted mom. Her biological mom. Her biological mom is considered white. Funny that in this country, you can be a different race than your own mom. Isn't that weird? So we in the United States believe that we classify people according to skin color. And on a rough basis, if we don't know who they are, we do. But it's not really how we classify people. So a place like Brazil, they'd be scrutinizing the skin color and they'd give Halle Berry a term for her skin color, and they'd say, oh, she's light wheat colored or something like that. One of those color terms we talked about before that people really scrutinize. In the United States, we have a different idea. And the idea is what is called hypodescent. The rule of hypodescent, which is a big anthropological word for if you are the product of a mixture, then whatever the kid's race is going to be the lower one. Now I put lower in quotes here because this is only according to the hierarchy that exists. This is not because of anything real. So if someone who is white and someone who is Black, as we just saw, gets together, then that child is going to be considered Black. So yeah, Halle Berry, Barack Obama, that would be the traditional way in which we classify people. And in some states, you're all right. There were laws. If one of your grandparents, that's a quarter, if one of your grandparents is of Black or of African descent, then you are. Or if one of your grandparents are. Or if one of your great-great-grandparents is. Or in an extreme case, there was what they called the one-drop rule. If you have any African ancestry, you're considered Black. So it leads to this curious idea in the United States. One is this rigid categorization between Black and white, but it also leads to the fact that some people can, if you only have one grandparent, you just kind of, or great-grandparent, you just put those pictures away and move to Iowa. And the next time the census person comes, you just tell them you're white and fade in, you might say. So some people can cross a state line and then you can change your race. And you can also get on a plane or boat to Latin America because, as we saw, classifications in Latin America and throughout the Caribbean are often different than they are in the United States. And so people that sometimes go back and forth or travel between these places will be sometimes surprised, sometimes not, to find that they change racial classifications based on where they happen to be. And in some of these places, in some Latin American countries, they use a different idea, which is hyperdescent, which means the child gets to be the upper status. So you're trying to move up the ladder. Now, I'm not saying this is a better idea, but it is a different idea. Or, as we talked about with Mexico, but this occurs in other places like Peru, Ecuador, and all kinds of places, you have this other category, which is just mestizo, a mixed. And that is its own category, being mestizo, or being what we still sometimes hear in this country, mulatto. I don't know, some people say we still hear it, but it would be a mix between Black and white. This was a census category a long time ago for a little bit. There's this idea that you could check off mulatto or mixed, and that would be its own thing. But that disappeared basically under Jim Crow laws, got rid of that. You just had to be one or the other. Or, as in Brazil, you could have many different color categories and change through your lifetime. So throughout the Americas, there were different ways of doing race. And this is why, or this is one of the reasons why, the biggest idea of cultural anthropology is that when we look around at different societies in the world, we see different racial classifications. We also can talk about the ways in which race is a cultural construct. And so we're trying to, the idea is we're going to educate people, and that's going to solve our problems. So question, how's that been working for us? Have we solved all the problems? Yeah, I don't think we solved them, did we? No, didn't work out. Now, part of this has to do with something that happened a little bit before you were born. One of the things that has happened is that if you tell somebody, oh yeah, race is a social construction or race is a cultural construction, what are they going to say back to you if you just go tell them that?
Who?
Anybody, without presenting evidence.
I don't know. Probably that you're wrong.
Probably that you're wrong. What are they going to say? They'll be like, what are you talking about? Look at us. Well, what a lot of people don't know is when we say that race is a cultural construct or a social construct, we're not saying that everybody's the same. We never tried to say that there were no clines, no variation. We just meant that those categories are given to us by culture and can change over time. So it's been crazy misunderstood to believe that we're just saying it's all made up or in our heads or something. The other thing that has happened is that people see these forensic anthropologists on television or something, and they'll run in with a bone and be like, hey, it's a white guy. No. Many of you have been in forensic osteology or something like that. Yes. For those of us who don't know, let us say that a person digs up some bones and we're like, we need to find out who this person was. And they take them to you, and you're a forensic anthropologist or whatever you are. And they're like, what race was this? The thing is that the problem with the television method, and even for some people in these places, is what you are doing when you compare the bones to other bones is you're comparing and you're trying to get an estimation of ancestry, of geographical ancestry. And so you might say, okay, I'm measuring these bones and they most correspond to someone of European ancestry, right? Because there are differences there. And so then you would have to say this person was probably considered white in this place. But the problem is we often leap to the next step. There's a really good article, which I should probably assign you, about talking about how those probabilities are also based on the area in which the remains are found. So the same bones that are found in one place could be classified as a different race based on where they're found and the probability of that. The other thing that has happened, of course, is this idea that you can swab your skin and they'll tell you what percentage of this and that they are, or that there are certain medicines that you should take if you are of a certain race. I'm not trying to say these things are invalid or not useful, but anytime you bring in money into this thing, somebody's going to try to sell you something about race. We've talked about this a little bit before, but the idea that everybody should be of a certain race in a particular country or a nation has become huge, not just in this country, but in different European countries. Italy, France, Germany all have their ethno-nationalist parties that believe that the nation should be composed of a certain ethnicity. And ever since September 11th, it brought back all these things that seem to be in the past, but we now live with them. The idea that there are people who are barbaric and things that people hadn't really, language that people hadn't used in the public for a long time was brought back into the picture when it came to societies in the Middle East. The other thing that is still true, we still sort ourselves out by race, and the differences in wealth and where people live, the segregation of our schools, of our healthcare system continues to be. Our schools, for example, are almost as segregated as they were from Brown v. Board of Education back in the 1950s. And it's not because of laws that we have. It has to do with different household wealth levels and where you can buy a house and which neighborhoods you're able to live in. So we still have a very racially structured society, which we're going to read about in the next section, and what anthropologists and others call institutional racism. And this is very much still with us today. Now, a lot of white people believe, though, that racism is over, got rid of it. It's all done because we're thinking of what we call individual racism. So our ideas about other people or the kinds of comments that people make. So what I'm trying to say here is it hasn't worked so well. And the question is, what should anthropology do? Because we tried these different ways of educating people. What should we do? Now, one idea is that we should just bring back cultural relativism. And so let's go back to this quote. It sounds like something that somebody might have said in the last 40 or 50 years, maybe even last year. Modern existence has thrown many people into close contact. At the moment, the overwhelming response to the situation is nationalism and racial snobbery. That sounds like it's going on right now. There's never been a time when we stood more in need of individuals who are genuinely culture conscious, who can see objectively the socially conditioned behavior of other peoples without fear and recrimination. That also sounds true. We need those people around. But in fact, this was Ruth Benedict from 1934, 90 years ago in Patterns of Culture. Yeah, sounds like what's going on right now. So we could maybe we should just bring back cultural relativism. Maybe we just didn't learn it the first time, and we can bring it back and make people culturally conscious. And so indeed, a lot of anthropologists after 2001 put this thing on their syllabus, which I've shown you before. It's because it sounds like a good thing to do these days. Bring back this, make the world safe for human differences. And the Patterns of Culture book that she wrote in 1934 got republished 3 or 4 times since the year 2000. They just keep churning it out, keep republishing it and trying to make sure, pound cultural relativism into people. I'm going to give you a slightly different idea or a quote from someone I often draw upon for these ideas, Trouillot's idea that is racism a delusion about race, or is race made salient by racism? That is the crux of the matter. I love Trouillot and I love his writings and trying to read them, but I will admit that he is too smart for public anthropology and probably too smart for most anthropologists. And he's phrasing this as questions, which is, it might be better as statements. So what I think he is saying here is that racism isn't just a delusion or a false belief about race. So what anthropologists tended to think is that if we can just educate people about race, if we can just tell people that race isn't real, biologically real, then racism goes away. And it turns out that that doesn't seem to work, because it's not just that people are deluded about race and that's why they're racist. It's the racism that is what makes race salient or important or noticeable. In other words, it's the racism that produces race, not the other way around. And if that is true, then it's actually very difficult to just educate people out of the primary issue, which is not necessarily individual racism, although that's a problem. But it's difficult to educate them out of institutional racism. And I would even say that the more educated you get, the more likely you are going to benefit from institutional racism. And so let's put it to you this way. Why are you getting an education?
Make more money.
To make more money. Yeah, that's what we hope. You're going to have a great career. You're going to flight path your way out of here, man. We're putting you on the runway, and there you go. You're running, you're flying, your wings are flying way above the rest of these people.
Thank you.
We're soaring. Together we soar. That's right. Although I don't know how that goes with the Life Balance College. Not sure it fits, but I don't know. Anyway, we're gonna life balance your way up into the air where you're soaring above the people because you're having a great career. I don't know if you're making more money, but you're doing well out there. And then you're gonna have a great career and have a family and have some kids. And what's the first thing you're gonna want for those kids? Yeah, you want your kids to be happy. How are you gonna make your kids happy? What do you want for them? An education. Yeah, how are you gonna get them an education? You gonna homeschool them? No, that's too, well, people do that these days. What are you gonna look for when you go try to get a house? A good school. Yeah, where are you gonna find that good school? You're gonna find that our education system is based on property taxes, so the best schools are probably going to be in the highest tax districts, and you're going to buy the best house you can afford. You are benefiting from a structure of institutional racism. So the wealthier I get, the more racist I am.